It's my very great pleasure to present this evening for us, but I imagine it's the middle of the day for you in Scotland. This is a presentation that's based in large part on a book that we just published last week about charity in Australia, but it actually also, the presentation and in parts the book, draws on collectively about 10 years of research we've done into homelessness in Australia. Initially, it was a program of research around the problem of homelessness in Australia, but of course, as evidence from Pat's presentation and what I'm learning from Scotland, the world's changed an awful lot in the last 5 years, and there is very much a movement toward ending homelessness in Australia, similar to the rhetoric and indeed even some of the policy, and I know the legislation in parts of Scotland. So lots of our research has been around the professional and the social policy endeavours to end homelessness, and it's the kind of the connection between the very coherent and clear professionalised welfare state to end homelessness on the one hand, but then on the other, the prevalence of charity in Australia that perhaps is the antithesis to some of the work that's targeted toward measurably reducing or indeed ending homelessness in Australia, that we're trying to grapple with. We're trying to understand how these two forces are happening in parallel. But we're really going to focus on charity now, because that is kind of the key to the book. And when we say charity, we don't mean professional services that are provided by charitable organisations or not-for-profit organisations, but we very much are thinking about charity at the voluntary giving, or the practice of charity, the voluntarily giving of money or resources, and especially time. And this is in the context of giving to people who are non-family or non-kin. We really are interested in the activities of citizens who are out there trying to do what they can to respond to social problems. And what is absolutely key to our analysis and very, very key to our critical comments and remarks about charity is that often the citizens, if not exclusively, are responding to problems that are very much the result of a hollowed out welfare state, a retracted state, and actually what we've argued in the book, poverty by design. We have to really think about, at least in Australia, poverty that is the consequence of deliberate policy decisions, and we have great capacity at the policy and the societal level with the profound wealth that we have in Australia to actually do something very, very differently. So when we're thinking about charity, we really are thinking about what citizens are doing to respond to very, very large scale problems. What we actually see in Australia, and I think it's very, very clear from what the literature says broadly in the United Kingdom and also in parts of Europe, Western Europe, and even in Northern Europe, that charity is taking on a much larger role in society in responding to social problems. Whereas there was the dream, certainly in England, I'm not sure about Scotland, but in England after World War II and the Beveridge Report, that charity was going to be kind of superseded by a universal welfare state that was actually going to be sufficient to enable people to live as citizens, that was based on social rights. But certainly in Australia over the last, I'd say 25 years, since the mid-90s, when a Conservative government came into power at the national level, the role of charity has been significantly increasing. And when we say the role of charity, we're talking about large and small charitable organisations, charitable endeavours that are very much at the forefront of responding to destitution. But it's not only charity increasing in terms of the number of citizens in Australia who are relying on charity, but it's also increasing in other ways. What we've been able to demonstrate is that the number of citizens who are actually volunteering in charities, who are actually even starting up new charities of their own, is increasing. And we've been able to map in a very, very clear way through government funding channels and tax data that as there is a decrease in income support to people who are unemployed in Australia, and at exactly the same time as there is a decrease in state funding to social housing, all forms, the rate of poverty is increasing, the rate of homelessness is increasing, and the rate of citizens who are reliant on charity is increasing. So the numbers of charity is increasing. The government funding, direct funding to charitable organisations, not to provide professional services, but charitable organisations that are doing charity, that are doing the practice of charity, that government funding is increasing as well. So we're seeing a lot of macro conditions which are actually driving greater poverty and destitution on the one hand, and the need for those citizens experiencing this type of material deprivation to be reliant on charity on the other. And we talk about this as a consequence of a deliberate set of policy decisions that Australians make. And very, very importantly, we have profound opportunities to do differently. If we can kind of set COVID to one side, Australia is often portraying itself in the most positive ways about how abundantly successful our economy has been in terms of economic growth, in terms of the record for the developed country to avoid a recession, and also in terms of individual wealth. It's not inconsequential that the individual wealth that many, many Australians hold, apparently second only to Switzerland, is a result of large property investment. So there is great inequities in wealth in Australia, but nevertheless, there is significant wealth in addition to about 13% of the population, the data suggests, living below the poverty line in Australia. The key is we can do different, but we don't. We really, on the one hand, see this charity boom in Australia, and on the other, we see this celebration of the charitable as the new ideal and ethical citizens in Australian society. We're actually seeing all manner of different charity initiatives pop up all over Australia. A very, very famous one, or infamous one, depend how you see it, is this Orange Sky initiative. And it really simply is people who saw, two gentlemen who started this charity, who saw the squalor, the deprivation, the poor hygiene that people were experiencing on the streets as a problem that they wanted to respond to by providing washing machines in vans and driving around the cities. It's become so popular that there are now these types of vans happening in about 40 or 50 regions all over Australia. These people became Young Australians of the Year. They were awarded Australian Order medals, the highest medals that you can receive. It's kind of like being a knight in England. And importantly, there is a lineup of volunteers who want to actually volunteer and provide this kind of direct care. And what's really, really important is that many, many people see this as a spontaneous, ground-up endeavour to respond to poverty. But what we've been able to argue is that we need to think about this in a much more different way. We need to think about, firstly, that the people living on the streets in Australia are living there because of a retracted welfare state. We're really creating that need. But we also need to think about this spontaneous ground-up endeavour of the charitable with their mobile washing machines is not necessarily so spontaneous and just a community-driven initiative. All of the vans are operated by volunteers, but actually the vans, in nearly all cases, are paid for either directly or indirectly by the state. The state provides massive grants of millions and millions and millions of dollars to these initiatives. In fact, some governments around Australia thought that this charity model was such a great idea that they have developed new funding streams within government to be able to provide this direct government funding so more of this type of charity could exist. And this is also really important because there is some philanthropic funding toward these charity models, but the tax legislation in Australia, and I think similar to most of the UK, actually means that those donations to this type of charity constitutes a tax deduction and therefore a loss of government revenue that could otherwise be spent toward providing affordable housing, the models that were mentioned earlier. What's really, really important, though, is that these type of models, and we can also see here the sleep bus, this idea of fitting buses out so people can drive around. What we need to think about is, of course, they're responding to a profound need, but they often kind of embed homelessness as a normal kind of social fact. They can make the public feel that everything is okay here, something is being done. I can't see any of the video, so I'm just going to keep talking until someone tells me otherwise. Does that sound okay?
You can't hear me by any chance now, can you, Cameron?
Oh, there's Andrew. I can hear you indeed.
Oh, wonderful. I've been through 3 devices, and I'm back on the first device, and it seems to be working now, so go figure.
Oh, well, shall I hand over to you, Andrew? You
if you like, I'm enjoying listening to you, but I'm happy to jump in.
Please do.
Okay, sorry about that, everyone. That was a bit of a bungle. I'm not sure what's going on with my computer, but I'm glad to be able to speak to you now. Cameron, if you don't mind, if you wanted to keep sharing your screen, then we can. Or I could potentially share. Oh, that's all right. I'll share mine. I figured out how to do it. Don't worry about it.
Okay.
So, thanks, Cameron, for setting the scene for us with the discussion so far. Sorry, I'm just getting my screen. So basically what Cameron has done is laid out the scene for us in terms of the kind of growing role of charity in addressing poverty and homelessness, in particular in Australia. And so what I wanted to do now is move on to a discussion of our research around charity. Can you guys see those slides, or is it not working? If not, Cameron?
Sure. Is that working?
I
can't see those slides. What about that? Are those slides being shared? Can people see those?
No, it seems to have stopped since I came online and ruined everything. That's okay. I mean, yes.
All right. There we go. We're back on.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for your patience. I'm sorry this is a bit of a technological quagmire we've wandered into here. So I'll just pick up where Cameron left off by talking about some of our research. So one of the things that's really, I guess, animated us about the emergence or resurgence, we've been calling it, of charity in response to poverty and issues like homelessness is that it presents us with a kind of what we've sometimes been sort of referring to as a bit of a kind of moral or political paradox or set of moral complexities. On the one hand, it's hard to deny that sort of citizens and organisations standing up and responding to the poverty and hardship that they see in society themselves is a good thing, right? That we want to be clear in the analysis that we put forward that we're not necessarily criticising people or their motivations. On the other hand, it's well known that charitable responses to poverty, and particularly the kind of examples from the homelessness space that Cameron was just talking about, address the symptoms of people's poverty and the symptoms of homelessness, right? So a lack of a place to sleep at night, a lack of facilities to clean one's clothes and to clean one's person in many cases. So they respond to these symptoms of people's poverty, but they don't necessarily contribute to addressing the underlying causes of that. Causes which, in our discipline of sociology and in social policy generally, are well understood to be structural issues, right? They're related to the distribution of resources, unequal distribution of resources in the economy. They're related to changing labour markets, and all of us live in contexts that have experienced significant deindustrialisation and the loss of many traditional jobs that sustain people for much of the 20th century. And they're also, poverty is also driven by unequal unequal housing markets, right? So we know that homelessness isn't just a response of poor choices or because somebody has a particular medical or mental health condition, that it's also related to the way in which housing resources are distributed within our society. And I think Cameron was leading to that. So we've got kind of this moral paradox, or this kind of, in a way, political paradox with charity that really animated our research. So in a book that we've just had come out, or just published last week, called Charity and Poverty in Advanced Welfare States, we sort of take this paradox as a kind of jumping off point, and we ask a series of questions about charity's role in contemporary society and the ways in which our societies as a whole respond to poverty. So we ask, what is charity's role in society's response to poverty? How is it understood and perceived by the public generally, as well as those who are engaged in practicing and receiving charity? What are its consequences? Particularly, what are its consequences as experienced by people who are the recipients of charity, who rely on charity to meet their basic needs? And finally, how can charity be transformed to actually augment or capitalize on those, quite powerful intentions that are behind people getting out there and trying to do something about the social problems that they confront, but that it also goes beyond that to actually start to, or to contribute towards addressing or trying to actually end poverty and homelessness in societies that, as Cameron said, can well afford to do so. Now, I was going to start with charity's role in addressing response to poverty. Now, thankfully, Cameron has already covered off a few of these issues. I was going to speak about the fact that we can't really understand charity and charity's role in addressing poverty without talking about changes to the welfare state and to poverty itself and the causes of poverty itself. Now, Cameron sort of already mentioned this, that in developed countries, and in our case, the case we studied in Australia, we've seen several decades of welfare retrenchment and welfare restructuring, including, I guess, the freezing, the effective freezing of income support payments. We've seen major underinvestment in social housing, as two particular examples. And I know that the UK has experienced kind of similar issues over, in particularly over the last 10 years as well. Now, in our research, we were able to show, to I guess, correlate these welfare cuts with rising or deepening poverty. So we're seeing social policy changing in such a way that contributes to growing poverty. And at the same time, we were able to show an increased reliance on charity by people who are experiencing poverty. And we measured that increased reliance in terms of not just how many people were using charity, but also how frequently people used it. And we showed that we were able to show that charity isn't just a one-off thing for people, that many people come back multiple times within a 6-month period. Thank you, Cameron. So that's charity's role in addressing poverty. And if we think of it at that sort of society-wide perspective, we can see that there's a kind of relationship there between what the welfare state does, what public support does, and what charity does, right? There's a kind of welfare changes create a need for charity, and then charities, individuals and organisations step up to address rising poverty that they see. So we've got to keep that relational aspect in mind. The next thing that we wanted to talk about is charity's meaning. And by this we mean the way that the charity is understood by the state, by policymakers, but also by broader society. And in order to, I guess, assess this, we analysed a series of policies and political statements, political speeches by politicians in Australia regarding charity, and we also did a systematic analysis of the last 10 years of media reporting on charity. So the findings I'm going to talk about here sort of are drawn from that analysis. One of the main things that we found is that public understandings of charity, as represented by these two data sources, foreground the significance that charity has for the giver and for society more broadly. So what we mean by that is that there is a tendency to, in the way we think about and talk about charity, to celebrate and focus on the compassion, those good motivations that motivate people who give charity, people like the guys who started Orange Sky Laundry or the Sleep Bus, or you can name your commensurate example from the UK. We tend to focus on their motivations, their compassion and their ingenuity. And there's been a lot said about the ingenuity of Orange Sky Laundry when we think about charity. And people get very defensive if you criticise charity, charitable responses from a kind of structural perspective, pointing to these motivations as a kind of, as a kind of saving grace, or for lack of a better word. The other thing that comes out in terms of public understandings of charity is that charity is promoted, and this is particularly the case in public policy, as a good thing for society because it helps cultivate resilient communities, right? This is an example of communities getting out there and addressing social problems for themselves rather than waiting for or relying upon the state to do it. And there's even some instances where this is kind of, charity here is seen as cultivating a form of social solidarity, right? It's about citizens caring about one another, banding together to do something about shared problems. And look, there is something to this, right? Even though we are kind of critical of this overall perspective, there is really something to this, and we'll return to that at the end. Now, what's not really covered in the meanings of charity, as represented in our data, is that the consequences that charity has, or the outcomes it's able to produce for people who experience poverty, right? So these outcomes are either more or less overlooked for a focus on the significance for the giver or for society, or it is just simply assumed that the good motivations and the ingenuity of charitable individuals or organisations translates into positive outcomes for people who are poor. Next slide, please, Cameron. All right, the next thing we wanted to touch on then is charity's consequences, or I could have called this charity's outcomes, right? So it's basically, what does charity do, what is it able to achieve, and how is it experienced by people who are recipients of it. And in assessing this, we assess this in a few ways, but what I would really want to focus on here is that we tried to focus on how charity was experienced from the recipient's perspective, right? Because this is what was kind of left out of those broader public discourses, those public representations and ideas about charity. So we drew on some ethnographic field work that Cameron and others had done, where they'd gone out to charity support centres, places where people would access emergency relief, access to supermarket vouchers, and things like that. And they carried out interviews with people providing and receiving charity there, and carried out some participant observation. So what I'm presenting here is a kind of snapshot from that on-the-ground data collection that Cameron and some others engaged in. Now, what we found when we looked at charity from the perspective of the recipient is that charity is indeed central for many people's day-to-day survival strategies, right? So people spoke about how they wove charity into their day-to-day practices, that it wasn't uncommon for people to talk about dropping in somewhere for breakfast, or even there were some cases where a gentleman outlined, being at different places to get a free meal or to wash his clothes, or the like. All of those activities more or less structured his day. So when we think about what charity does, that we definitely don't want to belittle or downplay its impact. People really do rely on it in Australia, and from the international literature we can see from the UK and places like the United States as well. So one of charity's consequences is that it enables people to survive. And when we dug into people's accounts of why the charity was so important to them, it became clear that they were using charity to supplement inadequate welfare payments. So the majority of the people that we encountered were unemployed. Some of them were homeless. Many of them were homeless. And that they stated that their welfare benefits were not sufficient to cover their basic needs. And I've just chucked up one brief exchange here as an interview between one of our researchers, and a gentleman that we've called Goff, where the researcher asked him, what drives your need to come here to the charity centre? And he says, well, to put it bluntly, F all money. Rent is $500 a fortnight, and I get paid $680 in welfare payments. And then he went on to describe how that 180 gets eaten up on other things, and he has to supplement it with charity. All right, next slide, please, Cameron. Okay, so one of charity's consequences is to help people to sustain and as a kind of survival strategy, enable them to use it as a survival strategy in their everyday lives. However, when we also uncovered some more negative consequences or outcomes from charity. And primarily what we found is that people found charity or accessing charity an incredibly shameful experience, and many of them avoided it unless they absolutely had to engage. And when we sort of dug into these feelings of shame, it became clear that they derived from the fact that accessing charity made people feel passive and dependent, and because they were taking something without the ability to give back, right? That there was a kind of inability to reciprocate the care that was being shown to them. And the quote below gives you a bit of an insight into the way people felt. A participant we called Julia said, "It's the most degrading thing I have to do. Honestly, you feel like a real bum. It's horrible." Now, this kind of I guess, shame-inducing relationship is kind of built into the structure of the charitable exchange, right? You have one person turning up who has not, who is kind of asking for something from someone who has. So there's a power relationship built into that encounter. However, what we found is that that notwithstanding the kind of structural nature of the shame that people experienced, that shame could actually be exacerbated or attenuated by the way in which volunteers engaged with people experiencing charity. And this becomes really important for us in the way in which we think about how charity might be reimagined and transformed. Okay, so moving on to the final section of the presentation. Now, I'm sorry that we're quite a bit over time because of our various technical issues, but if you're happy to persevere, then I will run through these last few slides. Cameron, I'm assuming you're okay with me just ploughing on. If you want to jump in, then please do. So while it is clear, for the reasons we stated earlier, that charity alone cannot address poverty, right? That it can't solve poverty on its own. It can certainly ameliorate the consequences of poverty, and as we've shown, but it can't on its own address those structural causes. This doesn't mean, however, that doesn't have a role to play. And we really want to emphasize that we're not anti-charity and that we do think that it has a role to play within the way in which our societies, contemporary societies, respond to poverty. However, we think that if charity is going to play this role and play it well, what needs to happen is for it to be restructured or reorganized around the needs and perspectives of people experiencing poverty, right, of the people who use charity, and moving away from that kind of perspective that we spoke about earlier that was more heavily focused around the perspectives and the benefits to the giver and to society more broadly. And one of the ways that we suggest that this restructuring of charity can be done is for charity to, I guess, leverage its role on the front lines of poverty relief, and to take on a more active and advocacy role in advocating, particularly advocating government for structural changes, right? Now, we acknowledge that a lot of established charities already do this, and I know that's the case both in the UK and in Scotland in particular, as well as in Australia. However, with this kind of boom in charities that we're seeing, and particularly with the kind of homelessness charities that Cameron and Cameron was mentioning earlier, there is this is often not a role that's taken on, that people focus on the kind of day-to-day meeting of needs rather than thinking about these broader structural issues. Now, we think that charity is in an auspicious position to advocate for structural change. And there's a few reasons for this. One is that the esteemed social position that charities find themselves in, right? You know, when we spoke about the meaning of charity a minute ago, I spoke about how charity was kind of a valorized activity and people who provide charity are celebrated. This provides charities and the charitable with a really powerful platform on the basis of which to advocate for the people that they're helping, and to advocate, and this goes on to one of my other points below, to advocate on the basis of their relationships and experiences engaging with people experiencing poverty every day, and to be able to tell the kind of stories like the story from Goff that we presented a minute ago about the way that inadequate welfare, access to welfare payments drives his poverty and drives his need on charity. So on the one hand, charities and the charitable have this platform, and on the other hand, they're kind of on the front lines and can act as a voice and to bear witness to the everyday struggles of people in poverty, and to reflect back the kind of structural issues that people that shape people's experiences. We also think that charities are in an auspicious position because they tend to have more freedom than government themselves, but also other organisations that are working in the welfare space who may have have contractual arrangements with the state. And there's been a lot of work done, particularly in the US, in the way in which the kind of outsourcing of welfare services has contributed, or a side effect of that has been a kind of curtailing of the ability of not-for-profit organisations to speak out on policy issues. All right, next slide, please, Cameron. And this is my last one, I believe. So in addition to moving towards a kind of more active and advocacy-based approach, we also think that the charity can be transformed at the level of charitable encounters. And what we mean here is that kind of day-to-day interaction, the providing of help, and talking and engaging with people that we spoke about as producing shame earlier on. So we think that charity certainly should continue to provide direct support and relief. However, we think this should be done in a way as much as possible that minimises the shame that people feel. So this may include, and this is something that came out of our research, is that providing support with as few conditions as possible. So one of the things that really drove shame, that people reported drove their experience of shame, was when volunteers were sceptical about their needs or questioned why they keep returning for charity, or somehow implied that it was the person's own fault or it was the result of their kind of choices. And they said this really deepened their sense of that they were doing something wrong and that they were in a subordinate position. However, they also said that when volunteers listened in a non-judgmental way, enabled people to articulate their stories in their own words, and also enabled people to account for their strengths, right, and the kind of ingenuity that they showed in and actually being able to survive on meagre incomes and in, quite unappealing, for lack of a better word, conditions, being able to present themselves as having capabilities and strengths was also a really important thing for mitigating shame. So these are things that we think that a kind of transformed model of charity could attend to, and through a focus on people's needs and perspectives. Finally, we've also suggested that charity be transformed in a way that provides opportunities for reciprocity. Now, this is kind of a complicated point, and I won't get into it too much because we're already over time. Now, but what we mean here is not a kind of mutual obligation conditionality thing where say a homeless person has to work at a charity 3 days a week in order to qualify for access to support. That's not what we're going for. But we do think it is important to open up the possibilities or the opportunities for people to take on a more active role in their own and others' support, and to reforming. And I think charities are a good place to do that, right? Because they are on the ground with people, and they do have a kind of flexibility that government services often do not have. All right, I'll leave it there because we're drastically over time. Thank you very much for listening, and my apologies again for the technical dramas.